Back in the summer of 2015, you and I drove the first of the third coming of Volvo. It was called the XC90, and the Swedish gods that brought it over, they promised something like 18 new cars by 2020. Well, I did as any respectable New Yorker would, stood back, folded my arms, and said, I will believe it when I see it. Well, here we are a little shy of 3 years later, and we've had the XC90, the S90, the V90, V90 Cross Country, XC60, and now we're adding something called an XC40. So two things. Number one, I am dizzy, and number two, very glad that I did not bet against Pekka, Per, Stefan, or whatever the hell the guy's name was. Welcome to a rather rainy day in Texas. My guess is the stars will not be shining bright this evening, but you and I still need to do the job of driving the XC40. And with that, we got a little bit of an elevation change on a straight back road here. Put our foot into it and see what the pulling power is like. Actually, it's a little bit of pushing power too, because this one is all-wheel drive. And I am somewhat surprised. Now, you and I talked about this in the tech review. It's almost 250 horsepower, 248 to be exact, but more importantly, 258 pounds of torque, and that works incredibly well here. I've been driving this thing in and around Austin, and it works more so in town because the torque comes in so low. And frankly, if you look at cars this size in this segment, almost 260 pounds of torque is quite a bit for this size vehicle. Now, a little hen advice here, especially as we come around a wet turn here. Please don't try this at home. There is more torque steer when you're trying to demand power at low speed. So like in and out of traffic or from basically a starting stop. You just want to get some power. There's more torque steer here than in the other like 60 and 90 cluster Volvos. Now remember, there's a reason for that. This is a different architecture, but that's in the basic mode. Let's try it in the fancy dynamic mode, which gives us a little bit of change in the throttle mapping, and let's put our foot into it a bit more. And I will say the torque steer is a little bit less at this mode. And it's, I mean, is it fast? No. Is it like that V90 R design that we drove, that wagon that we love so much? Not quite that, but I would argue more lively power than most vehicles in this class. And you're thinking like a GLC 300, or even, I know it doesn't sound like it's a competitor, but like a Nissan Rogue. Now that has the problem of a CVT as opposed to this being a real 8-speed transmission, and I would argue that probably gives us a lot more of the pep because there's more gears in which to do more jobs, especially around town. Now, my XC40 Tech review, I deliberately held back some information on you, logic being, let's talk about it when we actually drive the car because it has to do with suspension. Now, let's think back to an XC60. If one said, they gotta have an XC60 on steel springs in our design, that means that the springs are about 40% stiffer. So says Stefan, who set up the driving dynamics of that thing. Well, the same logic applies to the XC40, so that's good news. But there is an adjustable damper system on offer in the XC40 as well, but it's different than, say, what's in this thing. So if you were to look at an XC90 or an XC60, that has air ride optional, but it's at all four corners. In a sedan or a wagon, it's air ride only in the back. While in an XC40, no air ride, it's just regular dampers that are adjustable. Got it? So I would argue this is one of the more important Volvos you and I have driven over the past, say, 3-4 years, even more so than that 60 cluster of cars we just drove, because this is a totally different architecture from the scalable product architecture that underpins the 90s and the 60s. This is the compact modular architecture we talked about in the full tech review of this car. And that's to underpin smaller Volvos that are coming out besides this one. And really, the same concept applies. It's one fixed point, which is the dash to axle ratio. But really, how does it work out on the road? So let's put our foot into it. Not something you would normally try with a compact crossover. These kind of roads, especially wet, please don't try this at home. Brake, 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 coming around this turn here. And let's just say that there's definitely squat in the outer rear quarter. It's not necessarily a lean, but there's definitely squat in whatever corner's getting as much compression when you're really pushing it through a turn. Now granted, that's not what this thing is designed for. It's engineered for city centers, dragging the rugrats to like Gymboree or wherever the hell you take them. And at that job, very composed driving dynamics, especially when you keep the speeds moderate. Again, been driving this thing in and around Austin all day. It's out here on these roads where you noticed a little bit of degradation in ride quality when you're getting up to high speeds or broken pavements or turns like these, which again, really, this is not what this thing is designed for. Now that's in dynamic mode. Let's kind of slow it down coming around this turn here, switch to comfort mode, bring the speed down a little bit. And here, if I'm honest, when you think, what is this, low 30s to like mid 40s, it's competitors all over the map. You know, you're looking at things like Rogues at low 20s to GLCs in the mid 40s. Now, a Rogue or a Toyota RAV4, similar sized vehicles like this, they're about the same wheelbase. We talked about this in the tech review, one about 106-inch wheelbase. The ride quality is not even close in any of those like mass market segment cars or crossovers. In a GLC, or I would argue the Audi doesn't even come close to this. This is more the GLC is the closest thing in terms of the overall composure of driving dynamics when you're not pushing it. And frankly, this is not the vehicle you're going to be pushing. Let's focus on something completely different. Like, ingenuity is the mother of invention. It doesn't always have to be like a Dave Coleman high compression engine or even a GT3, as much as we love those things. It could be something as mundane as storage. Let's try something here. See if I can get this thing working. Okay, it magically works. Let's say for the sake of discussion, you go out shopping and you get those little bags and you put them in the back of a vehicle like this, and you go just for a mild-mannered ride home, and it ends up looking like a flea market back here just by going and making a couple of turns, not even going on canyons. Well, there's a solution back here. This divider thing comes up, it locks in place, and then you have like a wall. Now, it would stand to reason if you put the bags here, it's still going to look like a flea market or at least a Turkish bazaar after everything moves around here just by making like one turn in the neighborhood. Well, there are 3 hooks here in which you can hang the bags off of. Now, I love simplicity, and that is probably one of the cooler tricks here, but there's still one more. Let's say for the sake of discussion, you go to my favorite store, Costco, and you need to put a lot of crap in there like butt tape. Well, it's not really going to fit all of that in there. It's going to go over the parcel shelf. What do you do with the parcel shelf, especially if like Kumo's in the back? There's no room for it. So you'd have to leave this thing at home. My OCD, that would be a problem. This parcel shelf comes out, okay, ready for this? And then it turns over. Notice the shape here. It turns over, goes into this little storage area here, and then locks into place here so it doesn't rattle around, and you can either do the bag thing like this, or number 2, completely flat load floor, thus plenty of room for butt tape, or whatever you buy at Costco. Okay, so being the sky decided to open here, I decided to relinquish control of the vehicle to my chauffeur today. That is Matt Deegan. You've seen him if you follow us on Facebook. He did the Hoover Dam impression, the "that's a dam" impression. If you haven't seen it, you really do need to see it. But the other not so famous thing about Mr. Deegan is we like to call him the giraffe. And the reason why we call him the giraffe is the seat over there is practically all the way forward and all the way up, where if I were to open up the roof, he'd stick his head out, and he's all of like 5'2". So he would better off driving the car with his head sticking out of the sunroof, even in the rain. Almost like, you know, when Tom and Jerry cartoons and Tom and Jerry are driving the car, the convertible, he kind of looks like that in this car. Anyway, I digress. Let's talk about some packaging. I know you guys love it for some reason when I sit in the back seat of these cars, so here I am sitting in the back seat of the car. This seat is where I would sit. So, that is a 6-foot-tall person, not a giraffe like him over there, that's sitting behind himself. And remember, this is a 106-inch wheelbase we talked about in the tech review. This is better than some of the other cars that have similar wheelbases. Like, I couldn't do this in a Rogue. I couldn't do this in a GLC. I probably couldn't do this in an NX. I could do it in an RX, but that's a longer wheelbase vehicle. So really what's going on here is a technical term called a hip point. And yes, this is a real term that car designers and car engineers and car packaging people use in how do they place people and where is the hip point, because that has an impact on how much usable space is in a vehicle. So what they've done is they've taken the hip point and they've moved it lower, farther back, and in the process have scooped out more room to make this a usable amount of space in the back. And there's a trick going on here. You got to see this thing in person, at least from the outside, and you look at it and you would say, this doesn't really look like it competes with a GLC, a Rogue, a CR-V, or anything like that, because those are all about the same wheelbase as we've discussed. But this, I would argue, is a visual trick. What the designers have done with the seat pillar is that, like, you know, it kinks up on the outside. By changing that line, actually, did you see a little bit of lightning there? Wow, welcome to Texas. By changing the direction of that line, it makes the vehicle look a little bit shorter, but then you're completely surprised when you sit back here and have real usable space. Okay, now that we got some of the technical visual trickery out of the way, back to some of the storage, which is kind of the theme of this whole thing. We talked about the door panels in the tech review. Well, back here, same thing with the door panels. And then on either side of the seat on the floor, there's like a caddy of sorts to store like a phone, like I've got back down here. And then there's cup holders in the armrest. And then check this out, you know, like an old German car, so they've got the ski sack. Well, same kind of deal here. It's not really a sack, but you can put long objects here. Close this up. And then there's a center headrest that goes up, down, as my chauffeur drives kind of like a crazy man here in the hill country of Texas. This seat, or both seats, go down, but then the headrests themselves, they flip forward to go completely flat. Nice little touch there. Then on top of that, you have orange, lava orange carpeting, which really makes you think you've stepped into an alternate universe. And I gotta say, I kind of like it. Almost 9 years ago when I started this show, there was nothing on God's green earth that would get me excited about a crossover. But in that same time, the world has indeed changed, and you and I have driven hundreds of them. So you can see why a company like Volvo is getting into this market. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to saying I'm excited about the XC40. That's more going to be the V60R design. But I am going to give you a glimpse of a future episode to demonstrate how I feel about it. So about a week after I got to drive the Volvo, I got to drive the BMW X2, which I would argue is its direct competitor. And I will go so far as saying I much prefer driving the XC40 over the X2, and I definitely prefer the interior design of the XC40 to the X2. Now, what I don't understand, I'm still kind of letting wash over my brain, is the money part. Because at the end of the day, the car you and I drove today was like mid-40s. The base price of a future one coming out is going to be low 30s. Figure the base price of the one that's first going to hit the market is like mid-30s. So not exactly a cheap vehicle we drove today. For that kind of money, I'd always get me a used Lotus Evora. But I am broken. So I'm going to turn this around to you guys who are prudent, probably have rugrats, a wife, or just a family. Is that money, is it too much, too little, just right? And don't give me an answer of one of those things. Tell me why. Tell me what region of the world you hail from, what you currently drive, and what you do with it. Let me know in the comments below or via our social media, MotoManTV all word, MotoManTV all word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And with that, you kind of know what one of the next couple of episodes is going to be. So until I see you in that BMW episode, bis später.